Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing, what is this, like our 9th year now of conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I can't believe I've almost been doing this for 10 years. And, you know, when I get interviewed by people, one of the inevitable things, when you write about technology and you write about trends, is people ask you about the future. They go, oh, what do you think is going to happen? I always hated these questions because I'm not much of a futurist in the sense of really like deciding to have my spiel. I actually distrust the way a lot of people talk about the future because it's usually a kind of invitation for their own shtick and their own sort of spin on things. I prefer to keep a mind open to the possibilities. But I can promise you one thing, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. Without doubt, without question, this year will be weird. And it's not saying much, really, actually, but it's weird for me partly because my book High Weirdness will come out in April, May, and so it's going to be a weird one for me just because I'll be talking a lot about the weird, and I develop a whole idea of what the weird is. It's not just strange fantasy stories by H.P. Lovecraft. It's a whole way of looking at the paranormal, at looking at extraordinary, impossible experience. And it comes out of a whole of my dissertation that I did at Rice University under Jeffrey Kripal. And so that's part of the reason it's going to be weird for me. But I think that's just a fair assessment of what lies ahead. And my approach to that weirdness is to allow things to become a little bit weirder in my own approach. I've always respected scholarship. I respect skepticism. I respect critical distance, questioning, and I'll never stop being a questioner as part of my inquiry. But there's also ways to do that are tighter and looser. And there's also ways to approach the art of conversation, the art of suggestion, the art of possibility. And it's a fine line. In my book, I developed this idea of the tightrope walker, which is where you're able to sort of kind of cross over very strange possibilities, paranoid possibilities, speculative possibilities, entity phenomena, all of the kind of host of oddities that we talk about in this show, along with other things. We don't just talk about the paranormal here. But there's a certain attitude, a certain way of keeping balance, a kind of negative capability that allows you to stay awake and open, but also not really falling into either a kind of typical skepticism or the sort of resolutions of easy belief. And I think this attitude is a very important one to have as we go forward, and the amount of brainwash that comes our way, algorithmic manipulation, fake news, and then our own weird experiences and thoughts and research and how we integrate them. So I'll be sort of trying to hone in on this kind of the mind of the weird explorer as the year progresses. So it's a wonderful way to start off this year talking to Diana Pasulka. She's the author of the new book, American Cosmic, UFOs, Religion, and Technology, which is already receiving deserved praise, not just from fringe dwellers like me and a lot of you, but also people, which also includes my listeners, I'm happy to say, who are interested in these things, but not necessarily already particularly well-versed in matters UFO and strange phenomena and such. And she does that because she approaches this material in a very open, accessible, thoughtful, questioning, and critically informed way that I would say, like my own work, in a different way, is informed by our mutual friendship and peer relationship with Jeffrey Kripal, who sort of within academia really blazed a sort of trail of a way to approach what I would call the weird or the paranormal or the supernormal or the impossible is what he calls it sometimes, where you bring your critical skills to bear. You keep asking the kinds of questions that humanities people can't help asking, and yet you remain sort of rigorously open to possibility, even to possibilities that pull the rug out from under your own presuppositions. And it's a style that I think is very helpful at this time in history, because I do think things are getting weirder, not just because they're actually getting weirder, but because as consensus reality begins to sort of fragment, melt down, enter a labyrinth of mirrors, there's just more room for this stuff. Which means that the skills and the intelligence and the camaraderie among people who are investigating these things and keeping each other sane, as well as turning each other on to the impossible, I think is a really key element. And I consider Diana a peer in this effort. And I was happy to read early on in her book she discusses a gathering of humanities. Mostly humanities folks who were interested in UFO phenomena, and some of them were pretty skeptical, and some of them were pretty open-eyed, and there were some other characters there from the more UFO side of things, including one of the people who ends up appearing in her book. And I was at that gathering, so it was really interesting to see her take on it, and also the wonderful work that kind of came out of one of her discoveries at that conference, and really maybe that's where I can finally bring her on and we can start talking, is this the existence of a world of people who are technically sophisticated, scientifically sophisticated, working in industry, very successful in their fields, who also have an interest in the phenomena and are not interested in entering the sort of meme spray of the internet and all of the kind of hustles around ancient phenomena that pop media, ancient aliens and other strange phenomena that pop media like to foment. And so it's a kind of hidden world within an already weird world that she really ran with the football. So with that, Diana, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's great to talk with you again.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. There's so many elements. I kind of, when we started your book, I went through the first couple chapters, and I thought we were going to kind of stay in the universe of Tyler and James. And while they come back, especially at the end of the book, and there's a nice shape of it, you really do a lot of stuff in a short, accessible framework. So I quite admire that, having written a much longer book that perhaps doesn't even have as many perspectives in it. I admire that work there. So it's a little hard to figure out where to start, but let's start with these two kind of main characters. Tyler and James. And again, it's you really make a strong distinction that I think is so important between the sort of general pop media universe of discourse around the UFO and related paranormal phenomena, which is fomented by internet videos and video sites and YouTube, and a kind of hot house zone of self-promoters and hucksters and deluded people and fascinated people and obsessive and fans and all that whole stuff, which I think probably most of us listening have at least dipped our toes into. A distinction between that world and this other world that Tyler and James kind of open you up to. How would you characterize this other world that you were trying to bring forward and investigate in your work?
Right. So at that conference, all of us did. So you and I, by the way, I really enjoy speaking to people who have been trained like me in religious studies and know Jeff Kripal and read his work and are influenced by him, because I think that we're well equipped to study the weird. And we're well equipped to study the weird because we don't actually have to buy it, right? We don't have to believe it, but we can be completely engulfed and influenced by it. And so, it takes a few years to develop that skill. So I've enjoyed interviews by people who are, who have had that training. And I think that this kind of information and this type of, going into the weird or going into the paranormal is actually something that needs to be done and is required. Jacques Vallée did it in the 60s and the 70s, and he didn't have training in religious studies. I think that if you just, you have a certain mindset, you develop the skills. So that's definitely something that needs to be said. We study the weird in religious studies. We study stuff. I mean, look what I've studied. I've studied the purgatory. Purgatory is this weird place that Catholics kind of don't even know about anymore. But for many, many years, they did devotions to souls in purgatory. And how do you study that? Do you believe in it? So people who study religion study mystical phenomena. They study, saints. They study people who've seen what they think are angels and things like that. So it's not really a stretch to go into studying this culture of ufology, but also people who engage with what Jacques Vallée calls the phenomena. And I like to call it that too, because the people, Tyler, James, are both scientists who I met, and there were other scientists who were very much like them. And so you're absolutely correct that they're not on the radar mostly of, they are not ufologists. They don't call themselves ufologists. They're not involved in pop ufology. Tyler more specifically, and more than any other person I met, he actually engages in the study of this professionally. So he engages in the study of this, and he stays off social media, stays off the internet, develops technologies that impact our lives, inspired by what he believes to be alien technology. So what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with the myth, right, of Prometheus, that you've got this link to non-human intelligence, and it's giving you information about technology, and here he's actually creating these technologies. So, but you have the myth, but you also have the reality that this guy is actually doing this. So that intrigued me. And so I spent a good many years basically hanging around with them. We went to New Mexico. I got to see their labs, what they were doing. And at that particular conference that we were at, I also recognized this was eye-opening for me, because I realized that this group of people, the code that they are guided by, the code of ethics for them is absolutely opposite of the code of ethics for you and I. So you and I were trained, in academic ethics, which you show your sources, you're transparent, you talk about what you've learned. And if you do that in their culture, you don't work. So what happened was, the organizers, I was one of the organizers of the conference, were very naive, thinking that we could bring these two cultures together, mix them together, and have it go swimmingly well, right? Well, what happened were a series of very strange, tense moments. And I realized what those tense moments were about. They were about the clashing of the ethics of these cultures. So you have, on the one hand, you don't talk about what you know. In fact, that's why I used the pseudonym Tyler D, right? What's the first rule of Fight Club? Don't talk about Fight Club. So that you just don't talk about what you study. Whereas for you and I, that's all we do. We talk about what we study. So that was the first huge revelation that I made, was that if I continue with this type of study into this culture, which is a new form of religiosity, a new form of religion, then I'm going to have to play by their rules, or else I won't know anything. So, and I also have to understand, how do I play by their rules, but keep to my own rules as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was a remarkable thing about, there was another event that you also kind of allude to in your book that happened at that conference, where one participant accused the other person of saying things that he shouldn't have said, because that material was stuff that they both knew, but they had both learned under a certain kind of cover of secrecy. Yes. And so you realize it's not even just that there are things that you don't talk about. There are these levels and games that of who gets to say and under what circumstances. And essentially, you even though the material itself might not have to do with national security, you're entering into an espionage kind of framework. And that's one of the fascinating things about studying ufology in any way, really, but it means you can't go in any direction without hitting up against this problem of secrets. Who do you know? Information, disinformation. And so for me, it's, even as it's also, on the one hand, it is very much a new religion in a number of very rich ways, not just in a facile way that people have some belief in supernatural entities, but that it actually involves, affect. It involves these artifacts that you talk about that function like relics. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can talk about it, but at the same time, it's also this strange portal into what I think of as kind of post-war power, the way that power and knowledge operate in an environment where, espionage, secrecies, and what the CIA honcho Angleton once referred to as the wilderness of mirrors. And you enter into this wilderness of mirrors, and then as a humanities person, in a way, you realize that you can't pretend to be objective in the way that ethics of scholarship kind of want to be. You want to be able to hold a sort of kind of a ground that's not too stained by the things that you're talking about. But there's no way out. I mean, once you're in the thing, you're hearing the story and you're in the loop, and there's stuff you can say and you can't say, and it gets weirder than that. So, how was it for you to navigate that? How did you learn how to navigate with these people who in some ways didn't want you to say that much about, or at least the details of what they were doing?
Right. So what's really interesting is that that's one of the subtext of my book, is that if you go online and you type in UFO and you think that you're getting it, you're not. Because there is a lot of stuff going on, but it's not stuff that the public is going to figure out, and I know that's going to make a lot of people very unhappy. Okay. But I mean, I just have to report what I can say, that I've seen. So there's that. On the other hand, what I was doing was what my meta idea was for this book was basically saying that the environment of technology with which we find ourselves in now, with which we are implicated and are a part, will absolutely create a new religiosity. It just will. And it has. And the best example of it is this, the belief in non-human advanced entities, either from other planets, other dimensions, what have you. So many people believe this already. So here we are, and it's the environment of technology. I mean, during the Protestant Reformation, I went back to other religions to kind of show how that when technology changes, it changed with Plato. It changed the way in which people lived. The Protestant Reformation with the Gutenberg Bible and the printing press absolutely changed religion to something completely different. Of course, it's going to happen to us now. So I wanted to examine how this was happening. Okay, so that was the big picture of what I was trying to do. I had no idea that what I would get into was my own beliefs about the topic would be challenged. Now, in my field, in religious studies, you don't have to come down on the truth claims of whether or not non-intelligent ETs exist or whatnot. You don't have to say yes or no. You just basically study the people who believe it, or you're with the people who believe it and you write about what they believe. Well, here you had people who were completely successful academics at the top of their game, people who were absolutely successful entrepreneurs who also worked for the space industry. And they believed wholeheartedly that they were using UFO artifacts to create technologies. And, that was quite something for me to to understand with respect to what this new religiosity means. This new type of belief is not just a belief in the sacred relics of the things, the artifacts themselves, right? It was also turning these things into technologies that actually, Eric, you and I use on a daily basis, whether or not they these are real things, that they say they claim to be. It doesn't matter. Their patents are real. The inspiration has created these real things. So that type of transformational, almost incarnational aspect to it was something that I had to wrap my head around. And that was probably the most difficult. Now, also playing by their rules. The deeper I got into doing the research, doing the book, the more I realized that if I said certain things, I could get people in a lot of trouble. And no way was I going to do that. So, another thing that could make a lot of people angry, oh, no, it's your job as an academic to say this. Well, no, none of it's going to get somebody, put in jail. So there, I think that within this culture of people who study this, it's not controversial nor a big surprise to say that there are programs where people take oaths and they're in, they have to have oaths of secrecy. They can't talk. There's classified programs. We know the word classified. It's there. It's for a reason. And so that I've not been given any classified information, but I know people who do have. And so, if they say, please don't say this, or, don't say that, I'm not going to say that. Now, yeah, I had to make that decision. If I was going to write this book, I had to make the decision to incorporate some of their rules into the rules that I was taught as an academic. And I don't know how it's going to play out, but that's what I did.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the things that happened to me, it was really pleasant reading your accounts of Tyler and James, and James was at the conference, and I remember him and found it very intriguing. Person who had a very materialist aspect of his view of these encounters of the phenomena, even though he also included some, plenty of room for the far out. But he was talking about how it runs in families, so maybe there's something in the DNA, and we can start, doing family history as a way to understand what allows our body minds to tune into these dimensions or whatever. And it was, kind of flipped out. I didn't talk to him too much at the conference, but when I read about it, or when I read your account, I was reminded of somebody I knew in the 90s when I first moved out of San Francisco, who will remain nameless. And, I didn't become super good friends with him, but he was like this really kooky guy who was kind of around the scene, like the kind of rave psychedelic world. And, and he was an odd bird, and I couldn't quite tell. He had a kind of air of mystery around him, but he was very successful in some technological entrepreneurial endeavors. So kind of like the guys you're talking to. And then one day, for whatever reason, he kind of told me his story, and he was like an undergrad at Berkeley, and then like something happened, and then like he was like, and then the story emerged that like as it went forward, it became more and more kind of mythic, paranormal, surreal, whatever you want to call it, that involved like being shown these sort of underground labyrinths in the university at Berkeley and finding these secrets, and getting kind of inducted into these internal knowledges. And it was a very interesting thing. It was kind of spooky and kind of strange, and not dissimilar in some ways, not dissimilar from other people I have met who go on, describing their experiences or something that set of synchronicities that have happened to them. Where my kind of my gut tells me that while they're describing their experience, they're also sort of a little bit diluted, or they're kind of telling a story or whatever. And I got that feeling from this guy. But there was another part of it that was kind of, there's something different. Like, even if we just take a really like down to earth thing and say, well, okay, great. There's guys like James and Taylor. They're brilliant. They make technologies. They have wacky ideas. There's wacky people everywhere who have like crazy experiences. And if you ask them what they're about, they have these elaborate theories that are kind of unsubstantial. And so so what? It doesn't really tell us anything about, it doesn't make the phenomena any more real. I mean, an example that I would say here, not to say that he didn't have experiences or that weren't, was not to say that he was deluded or making things up, but I met Joe Firmage, who I did a profile, and he was a big tech player in the 1990s, and he had an encounter experience and became kind of messianic about it, and it began to impact his work because he really wanted to get the word out, and he had some very kind of apocalyptic ideas of what was just going to happen around the corner, and it ended up really impacting his career, and so that was kind of like an off move. But the thing that I think that your book pointed out to me is that even if we just think about it that way, there are these worlds within the government, within the espionage world, within the technology world, within the Democratic, National Convention. We know from Podesta that there are these inner circuits of believers who are in all of these elite realms of power, and they have their own way of kind of modifying information and building their own worldviews and sort of their own inspiration. So it's not just the farmer who has the experience out in the field and whatever. It's not even just the pilots. Like all the incredible number of very well trained, very rational, strong-willed characters who have these kinds of experiences, but that it's very deeply spread in elite culture, and it has its own flavor. Is this resonating with you? Is this ringing a bell?
Oh no, it does. Yeah. In fact, I just wrote something down. Okay, so if you look at the history of what I've written about, this is definitely different than that. So I've written a lot about Catholic history, and never in what I have written and published, and I even did much ethnography, being around people who are very Catholic, traditionalist Catholic, stuff like that. Never have any of these people met with the men in black, quote unquote, the men in black. But the people, Tyler, James, each had their own, quote unquote, and I put that in quotes because I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, men in black experience. And so who are these men in black, right? So James told me about the men in black. They came to his house. I write about it in the chapter on James. And at first he thinks he's being punked, right? Because he's like, what's going on here? And it turns out that these guys, they're there to find out what James knows. And they want to recruit James, okay? And so this never happens. So that's why I'm saying that this type of research was way different than the previous research that I had ever done in religious studies. So it definitely took, it stretched me. I really needed the help of colleagues to think through how I write about this culture that you're talking about, because this is a real culture. So James meets these men in black, recognizes that this is something he can't believe, he at first is very intimidated by them. They're quite intimidating. And then he realizes, you know what? I'm going to do this. This is really interesting. And I've wanted to do this my whole life. And so same thing happens to Tyler. Tyler leaves the space program for a while because he does a lot of his biotech corporations and patents and things like that. And then he's walking through an airport, and the men in black come to him, and they basically say, we want you to work here. Call this number if you're interested. And so he waits about a week, and then he decides to call the number, and he finds out that, he actually does want to do that. That's what he wants to do. So, you write about it. I mean, you just spoke about it as like this initiation, this initiatory type of another thing that people in religion and religious studies understand, that there's this type of initiation. And Tyler has told me before, you know what? You don't even know what's happening, and all of a sudden about a year later you're like, dang, I'm in this program, and I've heard about it, and now I'm actually in it. He says, you don't get a card, you don't get a plaque that says you are now in this program. You're in the program because everyone is in the program. But what keeps that program going though, Erik, is the silence, is the invisibility, is the code of what I call the Fight Club code, right? First rule of Fight Club. That's why I use Fight Club and I also, by the way, synchronicities, we can talk about that too. The synchronicity of Fight Club, I mean, there were so many strange synchronicities about it that I knew that was the correct way to spin these cultures. And I subsequently, by the way, have one of the men in black got in touch with me. And then I realized who he was. And I asked him, I said, "Are you that guy?" And he said, "Yeah, that's me." And I said, and in my mind, I was like, wow, I wrote about this person and this person just described that event and exactly how I wrote about it. So I felt somewhat vindicated that I had written about it correctly.
Well, another point you make on this point, we'll earmark synchronicity, is when you talk about Edgar Mitchell, who showed up at our conference on a video conferencing and spoke to us for an hour and a half or so, and I found that encounter very peculiar. I didn't really put my finger on it, and I think you did a much better job you did a great job of articulating what was just kind of an amorphous sense to me, where I was like, oh, what is this guy? Where's he coming from? What's his angle? Like, what kind of world do these guys live in? Because it's sort of like, even if they're not all billionaires, it's kind of like the way we think about, like, what is it really like to like be a multi-billionaire on our planet right now and no other multi-billionaires, and you go to these conferences and you're talking to other, I mean, in some ways you're just a normal human, and in other ways it's just such a different reality you're living with. And in a way, I think some of these people who are operating at the heart of power, whether it's financial power, technological power, military, et cetera, there's some different rules that begin to apply. Things get kind of, in a weird way, kind of magical, because it's a lot about these interiors and these initiations and these circles within circles. And one of the things you write about in your book, which was, I almost wish you had developed a little bit more, was when you talked about listening to Edgar Mitchell. Of course, NASA astronaut, has a mystical experience coming back from the moon. Ends up, it turns out later was even doing some psychic experiments in space. He's into the paranormal, and he founds the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So he's part of that kind of what you might think of as the New Age intellectual mafia that emerges in the 1970s, and ends up having a very powerful force throughout American culture, but particularly in California, and particularly in the technology industry. But when he was talking, he just used language in a funny way, and he pulled out. You're like, wow. It's like there's another world where they have their own kind of jargon, and it's sort of globalist and kind of it's technological. It's kind of new age, but it's not just like the sort of typical books you'd find. What do you think about that? What were the ways that he got you thinking about this question of language?
Right. That's a good question. So that was such an interesting interaction. So there we have Edgar Mitchell, right? And everybody wants to ask him a question. And we all have one question. And I read a lot about him, right? And so I knew exactly what I wanted to ask him. And what I noticed about him, and this is what I noticed about Tyler and about a lot of the people who were involved in this type of culture, was that they had a way of talking. I mean, certain phrases would repeat so many times. When you talk to somebody who's a post-structuralist, and they're a post-structuralist because they're using that jargon, right?
Yeah.
So, what they've read, who they've talked. They're in that kind of genre. Well, something along the same lines was happening here, where I identified there was a certain lexicon. There was a language that they were using. I didn't understand it. I didn't know it, but they used the same language for the same types of things. So he had this language. And so I identify him. That's why I call my book, by the way, American Cosmic, because there's a tradition of this group, this culture, and it's an ongoing tradition. And so, I think that we need, the Russian cosmists. In fact, my title is like an homage to the book called The Russian Cosmos by George Young. And he identifies this tradition within the Russian space program. And I thought, nobody's really identified this tradition here in ours. And here we have this man, who's unfortunately since passed away, who was on the moon, did psychic experiments in space, was, I found out, part of the SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. And he was using this language. And I thought, well, he's one of them. He's one of the, people who are the cosmos, right? So, I
just got to interrupt with an interesting thing. I actually haven't read. I'm gonna talk to him in just a couple of weeks, so I'm looking forward to reading his book. But I read a short piece on Medium from Douglas Rushkoff. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
So, and apparently in his new book, he makes the claim, which I seems pretty. Somebody who's spent a lot of time studying the stuff, we'd have to get Kreipel's opinion on this. But he makes the claim that. One of the things that happened when the Russians came to Esalen in the late 70s and 80s, which arguably played a not insignificant role in fomenting glasnost. I mean, it was a very important event. It had strong, it was. Stuff went down in those meetings with Russian scientists hanging out in the hot tubs with all of these sort of whatever consciousness expanders in Esalen. But one of the things that Rushkoff claims, and he has ultimately a kind of a negative take on it, although he also participated in these worlds, was that some cosmist ideas that were kept alive and sort of fused with transhumanism were kind of brought back into the sort of groovy, mystical, psychedelic consciousness expanding Esalen types, and they started to kind of become more and more interested in like technological humanist and immortality projects, partly because of that contact. So that the example of the Russian cosmism is maybe not just in parallel, that it's actually partly that connection, because that once you're in Esalen, you are also only one step away from SRI and what was happening in SRI. Right. I mean, it all gets very weird. Something happened and all that stuff, and in a way, we're also talking about Jacques Vallée without talking about Jacques Vallée. There's so many things to talk about. Anyway, so let's just stay with that.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. Thanks for telling me. I mean, yes, I'm absolutely convinced that that's probably true.
And it's funny because it starts to, if you go down certain realms in conspiracy theory, or even just certain ways that right wingers think about, globalism or liberalism, or the sort of technology as a kind of a conspiracy to sort of destroy moral values and create these new transhumanist worlds or whatever. You're like, it's not like I think that's what's happening the way they think it's happening, but there are things that they're pointing to that you're like, well, yeah, there did seem to be some kind of awareness or decision or imagination about the future that was like, its future is going to be very different. And if we're going to be able to like manage this future or be in this future or rule or succeed in this future, technology, networking, globalism, maybe the breakdown of consensus reality, maybe the introduction of technologies that, if they are not from outer space, are so so paradigm disrupting that they might as well be from outer space, that the only way we're going to handle this is if there's some kind of galactic myth, there's some kind of notion that's either human transhumanism or alien transhumanism or something like that. And that's why when we're talking about all these myths, it's not just about like pop media, it's also about some kind of, there's like larger storytellers that are going on, and it's very difficult to figure out what's going on. How did you keep yourself from spinning out into darker or more paranoid or more conspiratorial, manipulative kinds of visions, which is, of course, a lot of ufology can go in that direction, both the pop media and some of the real researchers. Other people don't do that as much. How did you manage the sort of deeper, darker implication aspect of it? Or maybe it didn't come up as much.
No, it definitely came up. I mean, in the beginning, there was a point where I just had to say, this is just way too weird for me, and I'm out, right? And I'm going to go write a book about this John England, who's this bishop in the Carolinas, in the 1800s. And I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. And then, of course, right when I make that decision, it's around my birthday time. And I'm having a birthday and it's not the best. And it's at night and I'm doing some of my work and I get an email from my chair who says, hey, someone is just donating this giant library to you. And she wants you to have it because she's dying. She has cancer. And I'm like, wow, that's really sweet and kind, And I'm thinking that it's a library of Catholic things, right? Well, it turns out to be, and I've never met this woman. It was Brenda Densler, who's, by the way, still alive, thank goodness. But she donated her UFO library to me, and she wrote The Lure of the Edge. And she has a PhD from Duke in religious studies. And so she gave me this gigantic library of stuff that I just went through it. And I was like, oh, gosh, I really do have to continue this research. So how did I do that? I have to tell you, Erik, that, I have a lot of kids. I have 5 kids. They're pretty young. I'm the chair of my department and I can't spin out. I mean,
Hey, Diana, I just lost you for a minute. So like, just pick up that, like, right where you're like, it's like, start off talking about, I have 5 kids.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got 5 kids, fairly young. They're the oldest is 15, and my department. So I'm pretty busy, and I have to say that my daily life, I can't spin out, right? I just can't. So I can't go off on the more negative. I think that the life I lead is actually helpful. Really weird stuff, because I can study the stuff, have my mind blown, and then go home and have to cook dinner. You know what I'm saying? I have to do those kinds of things that keep me really, really grounded, because I can't afford not to. And that's probably, I mean, if I didn't have those things, I probably would, I don't know. It would be more weird than it is. Well, but it's pretty weird already, I have to say.
Yeah, it almost seems when you talk about balancing the weird as you're doing this project, that it reminds me that scholarship and study and bringing those tools to bear, a combination of anthropology, of historical knowledge, of critical thinking, of sociology, all of those, sensitivity to religious patterns, that those skills are, it's not just that they're useful to try to understand the phenomena. They're useful because they help you navigate the phenomena. And I think, again, I mentioned Jacques Vallée, it sort of feels like his approach is kind of, hovering over this conversation, because, as you said, even though he didn't study religion or isn't trained in that kind of work, the way in which he recognizes that dimension of the phenomena seems to be a real key to other researchers in terms of the kinds of things you need to think about. So, what do you think are the skills or the benefits that come out of having that kind of training in religious studies, looking at this stuff?
Yeah, I think that religious studies is, and which Jacques was doing, and I don't think obviously didn't know he was doing that, but he's like an honorary member of religious studies, in my opinion. So, I mean, he basically, at his talk at the UN, he basically said, regardless of the objective reality of the phenomena, whether or not it actually exists, it actually doesn't matter, because look at how many people believe in it. Look at how many UFO religions there are. And so it's a societal movement, and it's only going to increase, and it is worth our time to study. Now, that said, of course, he believes in a phenomena, right? But he said that one does not have to believe in it. And I think it was John Keel who said belief is the enemy, right? So don't believe, but approach. And that's really what we're trained to do in religious studies. Now, there are branches of religious studies where, like the philosophy of religion in which we do discuss the objective reality of things, right? However, in our training, we're trained to bracket, I guess you could say, whether or not there's an objectively this non-human intelligence, or whether or not there's this phenomena. We do say people experience these things, and that's real. Okay. So these are the skills that we need when we go into studying this, because I think what happens is a lot of people say that normal people, they have a sighting, they experience really odd things, and they kind of, they go on to the internet and they Google, UFO or something like that, and they believe what they read. They don't know, that there are a lot of books out there. There are a lot of things out there. So they don't, or else they go to their MUFON chapter and they talk to the people there. They maybe post their experience in the MUFON database. And so I think that is where we get the mythology of the UFO, is that it's not examined in any kind of systematic way. And that's where the mythology begins.
Well, it's also, one of the things I talk about in High Weirdness is this sort of looping effect, and I know Kreipel talks about that some too. Or when you start to think about the role that writing and books and the information that you're getting from your culture sort of feed back within the phenomena, and that's where things start to get absurd. And it's not simply that you're reading something and you have expectations, and so when you have a weird experience, your expectations conform with what you've read, which is the typical materialist, reductionist, psychologizing approach to this kind of stuff. It's weirder than that.
Yes, it is. It's absolutely, definitely.
And one of the things you talk about along that line, which I really liked, is this idea of the book encounter. What's the book encounter?
Right. So the book encounter is what I call it. Arthur Kessler a lot of people talked about it. Carl Jung has talked about it. Arthur Kessler has talked about it in terms of, it's this, a lot of people experience it. So you have, Kary Mullis, the Nobelist in chemistry, talked about it as well. You have this question, you're studying something, it's occupying your mind, you want to know about it, and all of a sudden you randomly pick up a book and you open it up and boom, there's your answer. It doesn't have to be a book. It could be a movie you're watching, or I have a friend who the correct meme is always there for him, right? So, it's this thing that reinforces what you want to know. And so every one of the people that I feature in my book have had these encounters. Now, this goes into what we call synchronicity. And so what I have found in all the years that I've studied religion, and it doesn't matter which religion we're talking about, it could even be California New Age religion, and you find this a lot. And that's the kind of milieu I grew up in. I mean, I'm culturally Catholic, but I grew up in California, Northern California. My parents were Catholic, kind of New Agey. So, so synchronicity. So people experience in every religion, synchronicity is the engine of religion. So, you feel, wow, I've had this very impactful, important, profound synchronicity. It means this. And so they then, they think that they're on the right path, or, the synchronicity gives them some type of meaning. They interpret the synchronicity. And so what I found in the UFO culture with the scientists as well as the non-scientists was that you've got synchronicities everywhere, particularly within this thing called the book encounter. Now, I've had book encounters. I have them all the time. Okay, so what does it mean? Nietzsche, the philosopher, describes an encounter, kind of like a book encounter he also had. And my weird book encounter happened with Nietzsche, his some of his aphorisms in the gay science. By the way, in the New Year's Eve era, which were today's.
Oh, that's January. A good point. That's your story. I got to say that's one of my favorite parts of the book. Not only because it's a good book synchronicity. A lot of my synchronicities have been through text or books or happenstance with research, but it's just a beautiful passage too, and I never thought of Nietzsche having anything to say about recurrence or weird synchronicity kind of things. Of course, he doesn't use the term, but that was taking place around New Year's. So yeah, it's all.
Yeah.
We must be on the right path.
Yeah, right. Well, of course, his takeaway is that there's no meaning. He says no. He goes, the gods of chance are playing dice. And so, here I was having this incredibly powerful synchronicity with Nietzsche on New Year's Eve when he wrote this aphorism. And then the next page, he basically says, ha ha, fooled you. You think this is meaningful, but it's not. Leave the gods, and embrace the god of chance, because that's what's going on. And so, I came away from that very powerfully. Seriously, I don't know what it means. And so I think that that's the correct attitude. That's the attitude of religious studies.
Yeah.
These are powerful events, but can we conclude from them? I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but I did want to say something about synchronicity, and it's this. It's that this is a very specific example of how the new environment, the digital environment with which we find ourselves, increases a certain type of religiosity founded upon a synchronicity, because there are bots. Okay, so the bots provide to us those things that then that absolutely confirm our reality, and they create what I call synthetic synchronicities. So I also included a person's synchronicity that occurred to him completely through bots, right? And advertisements. And so, if you think about it, now that our digital environment within which we live is tailored to our own tastes, tailored to what we want to buy, tailored to what we are interested in, it's all listening. Our computers are listening to us, so we can just talk about cereal and boom, cereal pops up. And, a lot of us can then think that's a synchronicity, right? And so we are, so synchronicities, in my opinion, are going to increase, and they're going to be these kinds of digital synthetic synchronicities, and no less powerful, right? No less powerful, but I think that they can illustrate what, how we should, what we should think about synchronicities. I'm not saying that they're not powerful. I'm just saying that, this type of new environment is going to, supercharge synchronicities for us.
Well, what it makes me think of is that in a way there's kind of two levels to a synchronicity, where you have a specific one, which is like, you're reading Nietzsche and his thing is on New Year's, and it's New Year's, and that's a synchronicity. And then the next page he talks about synchronicities. So there's all of those loops that are themselves. Is this a message? Is it meaningful? It feels weird when you get it. It feels like someone's giving you a message. So that's one level. But the other level is like, what could the mechanism possibly be that would produce this event? So there's it's part of the power of the synchronicity is the overt content, the message, so to speak, always refers to some invisible mechanism that you can't understand. And that's partly what gives it that sense of spookiness. And what's weird about the technology is it's the same thing. Even if you know that the bots are just following you around or they're listening to you, you still, when people tell these stories, they're like, well, I don't have Alexa. I was just talking to my friend on the phone and I was telling him about whatever, my toothache and whatever. And then the next thing I got this thing and like, what is it reading me? And so it becomes this question of like, how good is the actual mechanism that we know about rationally that has nothing supernatural about, but it still has this sort of animism to it. There's still this sense that it knows more than we know, or it's doing something more than it's supposed to be able to know. Yeah. So we can't escape that animistic kind of feeling, even when we know that it is algorithmic.
Yes. And that's such an excellent point. That's why I spend a lot of time on Jacques Vallée's idea that the phenomena works like a technology. It's almost as if in retrospect, we can look at Jacques' ideas and confirm them. And we can say, yeah, it sure does. It sure does seem like it.
Absolutely. There's and when Kreipel wrote about him in a really great way. All the people I know who are into this stuff, like they're more like the valet approach, but I still don't, it doesn't really seem that outside of that particular kind of world that people quite recognize the significance of what he's done. And then we haven't even talked about the fact that he was at SRI and that he knew the remote viewers, and he was also working on what they call computer conferencing, basically, laying the sort of social conceptual groundwork for computer networking. And it was all layered in this remarkable way. And it's like all roads lead to Jacques in a weird way.
It's true. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. So, I wrote a preface about Jacques. I put it on my website, and I love my editor, but she edited it down to like 2 pages. And I think it's like 10 pages or something, where I basically talk about how he set up in the 60s and the 70s, the way which I believe we should study this phenomena, this new type of religiosity. And not discounting it, right? Not reducing it and saying, well, it's due to these forces, and it's not real. He doesn't do that. He's not a reductionist, but he's a careful researcher.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this conversation is so great. We're gonna do another hour, and we'll run it next week because there's more stuff to talk about. But with the time left, I just wanted to another element about Jacques that I knew about, but it takes on more significance in one of the stories I tell in a High Weirdness about Robert Anton Wilson. Basically, he plunges in the mid-70s Robert Wilson into high weirdness all the time, and he's basically in a kind of half psychotic, half visionary reality tunnel where he believes that aliens from Sirius are communicating with him, and he's getting synchronicities all the time and taking too many drugs, and it's all coming together, and one book encounter after another is weaving this whole completely bizarre worldview where he's in touch with these incarnate intelligences, and it's basically going over. It's a little over the top. And what his story of how he kind of comes back to his kind of bemused maybe logic about all this stuff is precisely a meeting with Jacques Vallée. That it was talking to Jacques Vallée and some of the way that Jacques communicated to him appropriate attitudes towards this kind of phenomenon that helped sort of heal him and let him leave what he called Chapel Perilous. But we're going to end it there for today. Diana, thanks so much for joining us, but we're going to be back next week with another hour of conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric.
Oh, great. So until next week, tune in again. Keep your minds open.
Awesome.